Today's reading is from the Gospel of Luke, and it causes us to reflect on humility and hospitality. So Luke chapter 14, verse 1 and verses 7 to 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you're invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then, in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God.
Please pray with me. All-loving God, we ask that in your presence this morning, we come to know you more. That through the teachings of your Son, Jesus, you illuminate a corner in us that has been in the shadows. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to you. Amen. So as Sandy mentioned in the announcements first thing this morning, I have just returned to Vancouver after spending 6 months in the English countryside, where I was working as the student minister to a United Reformed church. And the community that I was living in was relatively small, and while I am familiar with the concept of small-town hospitality, I was truly not prepared for what that was going to look like during my time there. There is this idealized image in my head of small-town living where people just pop by. They just stop in to see how you're doing. They just happened to be in the neighborhood. And in my head, I love this idea. There is nothing that makes me feel like more of a community than when my doorbell rings unexpectedly. In my head. But in reality, well, let's just say that within the first 2 weeks of being there, I had gotten so used to people just popping by that on one particular morning, as I sat at my kitchen table eating my toast, I saw my next door neighbor leave her home, and I threw myself off the chair, got onto my stomach, and crawled like this out of the view of the bay window, just in case she wanted to pop by. I am, perhaps to a fault, the kind of host who really likes to be prepared. I like to know that I have 17 flavors of sparkling water available. Everything from home brew to cold brew. I will have cleaned areas of the house that even I haven't seen since I moved in, just in case you decide to take yourself on the tour. I will have taken out the trash. I will have finished the laundry. I will have wiped that backsplash free of bacon grease. And I will have strategically placed all those little knickknacks you might have given me for Christmas 6 years ago out for you to see. There is a place I keep those just for times like this. But it sounds exhausting, doesn't it? And it is. There is barely enough of me left to give to you when we interact, and that was the whole point of the visit. But if you pop by unannounced, well, then there's the risk of you getting to see me just as I am. And I don't know about you, but just as I am doesn't always feel company ready. When we hear this passage in Luke, we're invited along with Jesus to attend this dinner party being hosted by a prominent Pharisee. And why Jesus was invited to this event is a bit of a mystery in a society where to embarrass oneself or to bring shame to oneself in front of one's peers, that was the worst thing that could happen. A host going to the trouble of inviting the loose canon that was sometimes Jesus of Nazareth, it seems like an unnecessary risk. Was it to keep a close eye on him, keep your friends close, your enemies closer? Was it to learn? After all, the Pharisees were a group of people really committed to correctly interpreting the laws of the Torah. And Jesus seemed to have a lot to say about that. Was it simply to further a personal status of importance, to host the one who calls himself king? Well, that must be worth something in the social hierarchy. We can't know the intentions of our host, but we know he had intentions. We can be assured that the host of the evening went to great lengths to carefully curate the event, including his guest list, sending out invitations to men of high stature in the area, and one particularly exciting invitation to a man not known to always make polite dinner conversation. We can call Jesus a lot of things, but miss manners, that ain't one of them. And yet, the conversation that follows at the table, likely over bountiful baskets of bread and cups spilled over with thick wine, is one seemingly of etiquette. And it's a hot take at that. This parable goes, when you are invited to an important dinner, don't assume your own importance in being there. Wait for the host to affirm you. Humble yourself. You never know whose presence you're in. Now, we might call this parable a lesson in manners if we didn't know better. But as you might be aware at this point in your faith journey, the Bible isn't exactly the go-to guide when it comes to social niceties. This parable, it isn't about how to avoid conflict in your clique or how to do right by your family or how to put on a good face in public. This parable is about knowing your worthiness in God alone and assuming your place at that heavenly table. Jesus goes on to address the host directly, though we can be fairly sure he did so in front of all of his other guests. And he tells him, look, all of us here, we can repay you in some fashion for this invitation. In fact, custom dictates that's expected of us. Maybe we bring you a thank you gift, the classic hostess potted plant. Or maybe as we're on our way out, we turn to you and say, next time, we'll host. But Jesus says, where are the guests who are just as worthy but cannot possibly repay you? The ones who might use the wrong fork, say the wrong thing, smell a bit ripe, believe a bit differently. Blessed is the host who fills their table with those guests. You see, when we remove ourselves from the social constructs that hold us captive, when we humble ourselves to God instead of to the social order that enslaves us, we remove the layers and layers of cultural expectations that drown us and leave us feeling never enough. When we remove the heavy armor and the thick scars we all wear, those of privilege or of sexism, of classism, addiction, racism, capitalist striving, economic inequality, when we do our best to strip ourselves of the masks and the wounds that we have assumed through society, and instead come to the table bare of any expectation that we are unworthy or worthy because of external circumstances. When we do that, we are given an opportunity to commune as God intended us to, just as we are. And it's not easy. The armor is welded around us. Memories of past trauma cauterizing any point of entrance so that we don't ever have to feel them again. Wounds, still tender from yesterday, we know we're going to have to feel them again today. To bear ourselves in the face of all of that is terrifying. It's no wonder we feel the need to bust out the good china. But where there is vulnerability, there is also a holy blessing of worthiness. The other week, before I came home, I attended dinner at a couple's home from the congregation I was serving. And while I knew our hostess quite well, I had yet to ever meet her husband. So I did what I'm sure any anal retentive person would do, and I read myself the riot act before I arrived. Now listen up, Andria, you don't know him. He may be very conservative. This is not the environment to bring up Brexit in. Also the rainforest. Stick with safe conversation. You don't know how he spiritually identifies. Just be good. Just this one time. Just be good. I am company, not family. Let's just keep it appropriate. Well, by the time we were finished with the lamb casserole, there was no going back. The ice had been broken with a heated debate over the decline of formality, and once the ice was broken, we were all swimming for our lives. It was Shark Week around that table. There was cheese flying out of our mouths, and the candles had become a real fire hazard, and I think I accidentally used the word soteriology. We were no longer company. In that moment, around that table, we were family. And we talked loudly and passionately and over top of each other for hours about all sorts of things, about what it looks like to be allies with the LGBTQ community and how to do a better job, about the changing meaning of being a nation and what it means to be truly multicultural and how we can better honor that through different faith practices in our schools. We looked around and noticed who was missing from our table, a gathering of middle-class, cisgendered, straight, white people, all of British descent. And yes, we spent a lot of time talking about Brexit. All of us were opinionated, and all of those opinions were different, and none of them were right, and all of them were convicted. It was loud, and it was messy, but man, it was important. And as I sat there, I thought about this passage, about Christ's invitation to turn over the tables, to do things differently, to forget about ourselves, and instead look to our left and our right at who is eating with us and remember those who are not and speak to that. To leave our company faces at the door and arrive just as we are, forgetting that perfect hostess gift or the vacuumed carpet, not concerning ourselves with safe topics, but taking the opportunity to speak truth into each other's lives, truths that just might change things for someone. Not only are these conversations Jesus would have lived for, they're conversations he died for. The ones where crumbs get flung and wine gets spilled and faces get red and beliefs, they get changed. Not conversations that are company ready, but ones that shake things up, disrupt the social order, confuse the ego, point to a greater source of love and life than just ourselves and what others might think of us. Conversations that connect us in a deeper way. Conversations that are worthy of the table. For Jesus to speak of company etiquette as a guest in a home of a Pharisee, it was not a passive-aggressive way of him saying, now watch how this is done properly. No. Instead, it was this open invitation to the greater table. The holy church, the communion of saints, the forgiveness of sins, life everlasting. With one caveat. How we act at that table matters. Whether we are coming together at the dinner table, the communion table, or the proverbial table, when we gather there, how fully are we allowing ourselves to show up? Are we bringing our whole selves, or just the selves that we thought were invited? And have we bothered to pass on the invitation? The Christian journey is this endless row of tables that need turning over. The guest who doesn't feel they belong, the host who feels they have something to prove, the change that can't happen if we don't say it needs to, the healing that can't take place if we keep pretending that nothing is wrong. Showing up for ourselves and for others is hard. Shaking off the weight of this world for the liberation of life in Christ, for us and our neighbor, that feels next to impossible if we can even define it for ourselves. If it were left to us, we would forever be declining the invitation. We would never feel company ready. Not for the friend, not for the stranger, and definitely not for Christ. But this living word is here to tell us that it doesn't matter how ready we think we are. If you arrive, really arrive as your whole self, bear yourself in the face of each other, in the face of God, Jesus says you will be honored. And if you welcome, really welcome, without expectation, Jesus says you will be blessed. Because the table of Christ is always ready. But it's not set for company. It's set for you. So come.